What does a technical architect who's seen it all see when they look at the modern digital commerce landscape? High Velocity's own principal technical architect, Adam Clason, walks us through the deep lore of React Next.js, as well as some potential gotchas, coding or composable. Also, are monoliths that bad? Huh. I'm Justin Burrows. This is Commerce Chats by High Velocity. Hi, this is Justin Burrows with
Hi.
Commerce Chats from High Velocity. I'm joined with Adam Clason. Adam, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Good morning, Justin. I've been working at High Velocity for a little over a year. I'm a code guy, software developer. I've been working on this Composable app.
And is it true that you're the principal technical architect?
Tay's been, putting out suggestions, so that's somewhere in that vicinity.
Well, I'm the hype man, so I feel you.
Did you come up with your own title?
Actually, I did.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to think of like what I would describe. Like I work on product, but then I also do a lot of like research and a lot of interactions with people. And I just never like any title that had the word evangelist in it just didn't seems very 2010 to me.
It reminds me of like the Microsoft, like I feel like it was like a Microsoft thing. They had like all these evangelists.
Yeah, and you've got like or your CWO, and you just have to think about like what are they the chief officer of, and it's like I'm the chief wombat officer, and it's like okay, so I figured it would be irreverent but still descriptive of the actual job title. Tay definitely has the energy of improvisation where it's like yes and so if you pitch an idea you better be prepared because it's like yes this is yes let's go let's do something like that, so which is good but can also be intimidating. You have to think about what you're going to say because then you're going to end up doing it. You're going to be moving rubber
Yeah.
tree plants. I think it's good to be able to kind of explore that. I worked on the integrator side for a long time, and I think one of the interesting things about working in product is you get to take time to think, how would I do this if I wanted to do it? And I think that's a different dynamic and exercises a different part of your brain.
It's totally different than someone coming to you with a set of requirements and what they want, and then you figure out how to, build that versus kind of starting with, in an ideal world, how would you go about building this?
Not many greenfield e-commerce projects out there these days. You're
No,
always
it's true.
implementing or building something. But now you started working on a platform, right? Like doing a
I started on working as a developer on a custom .NET e-commerce platform. So that was kind of homegrown by the company that I started working for out of college. They had a large retailer on there for a number of years. So yeah, that's how I got my start. It was not in like a Salesforce or a Shopify. It was kind of a homemade thing.
how did you
So
progress
yeah.
from sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'll say it wasn't greenfield for me when I got there. It was already pretty mature, but originally it was for that company.
And what was your journey from there starting on this custom .NET application to here?
We had that client on this custom .NET platform, and back in the Demandware days, which was I don't know 2013 or 14, that client decided to shift to Demandware off of this custom platform. They had grown, and they took us with them essentially. So our team that had worked on this custom .NET platform, some of us learned Demandware in order to help with this migration and then the subsequent support work. So that is how I ended up on a platform and on Demandware, soon to be Commerce Cloud. And then so I worked for a variety of clients doing that over the next several years. And then Tay gave me the opportunity to start on Composable, doing some Composable support and implementation work using next.js and commerce tools. So that was kind of an opportunity for me to get off of the platform work, which is good. And it was a tool that I did enjoy at the time, but I did kind of want to get back to more general web development and not be super pigeonholed into like, I know this one platform. So Composable was kind of a natural way to make that jump. So did some support, a implementation on Composable, and now here we are at High Velocity, building this storefront app.
So you mentioned Next.js. Could you, for us liberal arts people, could you describe a little bit of what Next.js is and React.js? I'm trying to understand. Like, I my understanding is that React.js is art or is the undergirding of Next.js, but they're separate things. Could you talk about that?
I mean, I think that's broadly right. React was created by Facebook initially. It's open source, but so it was created by Facebook because Facebook was originally built on this PHP system that is very server driven. So every time you make an interaction or you interact with a page, you kind of naturally would have to reload the whole page or do some like kind of funky Ajax stuff to add client side interactivity. So if you like a post on Facebook, it doesn't reload the whole page, right? It's a dynamic, an interactive interface. So Facebook built React kind of to handle that problem because it was a little bit of a wild west with like HP and jQuery being kind of the old way of doing it, which can get really complicated when you have a highly interactive interface pretty quickly. So Facebook built React, which is like a front end, call it like a rendering framework. So it allows you to more declaratively make user interfaces where you can say make a change in one spot and have this framework take care of re-rendering your app so that all of the consequences of that change are displayed, right? So an example in e-commerce would be you add to cart, on a PDP, and the cart icon updates, and then it potentially shows a fly out with what's your new cart. So that's kind of a reactive interface in e-commerce, but obviously it's a lot more broad than that. So React kind of enables that and makes it a lot easier than maybe it used to be. And then Next.js is what they would call a meta framework for React. So React doesn't handle by itself server-side rendering. So if you would just use a bare bones React app and you visit it for the first time by itself, it would be blank. And then you'd have to wait for the React app to load in your browser and then show you the app, which obviously isn't ideal for things like e-commerce where you want the page to be rendered on the server for SEO reasons and for user experience reasons. So there's a lot of these meta frameworks around React that enable this server-side rendering, and Next.js is one of those. So, for example, Remix is another one that I believe Shopify uses in some of their apps. And then there's Solid. There's a number of them. Well, Solid isn't technically React, but there is a number of these meta frameworks that do this. It introduces a lot of complexity, server-side rendering an app. So these frameworks are kind of a way of handling that.
I'm intuiting here that there is server side rendering and then there is client side rendering. Would that be the other part to that?
Yeah. So React by itself is only client-side rendering. And then you add these meta frameworks to give you the server-side rendering, then plus it gets to the client side and it still is a fully interactive React app. So you still have the client-side rendering, but you get that initial render when someone visits a page. So you see the full web page when you go there instead of waiting for the React app to render and load on the client side.
Would that be kind of like a cached page or something like that? Like for the first load? I'm trying to understand. Like you render it.
It's similar to, it doesn't necessarily come like a cache page. Just because something is server-side rendering doesn't actually necessarily mean it's cached. So if you visited a My Account page, say, that has all of your specific user information, a server rendering framework could generate that page on the server dynamically for you and give it to you outside of any kind of cache. A cache would be taking a page or a section of a page and delivering the HTML to you, kind of either regardless of the user or based on a particular segment.
Why would you have a server side rendering versus a client side rendering? What you mentioned SEO was one of those. What do those server side rendered pages do that client rendered pages can't?
Yeah, so obviously SEO is a big one. Essentially, what you were talking about is if you don't have server rendering, you have to wait for the JavaScript, the scripts in the browser to show the page. And the consequences of that from a user experience perspective are pretty big as well. So you'd have to, the UI would be popping in as React is able to load the data. And then you also have to, you have to have endpoints, like a server side endpoint that the React app would be talking to in order to actually hydrate the app. So you kind of would split it into two segments, because the React app by itself doesn't have the data that it needs to, say, render stuff from the CMS or from the commerce provider. You would have to expose services that the React app can call to get the data it needs to render the app. And so as it does that, it needs to wait for that data to come back. And in the meantime, you have to, how do you show a UI when you don't have any of the data for it? You either show a lot of loading spinners or something blank, and then you allow things to pop in. It makes for a poor experience for users, especially on mobile and slower internet connections. You don't really know what's going to be popping into the UI. Click a button you didn't mean to click, or you just miss an entire content of the page before you go to the next one because you didn't know that something else is going to be loading in. Server-side rendering is pretty much assumed for the most part on things that aren't like a dashboard app. It's not like, not doing any server-side rendering isn't really viable for most websites.
So I know that we were talking about server components. How do server components, and I believe that's part of React, how do server components play into the framework?
Yeah, so this server-side rendering concept has, it's helped a lot with the user experience and enables you to, deliver a fully baked web page to the client, but also has introduced a number of problems with how your data loads. So since it's rendering as a React app, most of these server-side rendering frameworks, like next.js, before server components, you would have an opportunity at the route level. So like before the React app starts to render on the server side, you'd have an opportunity like before that to get all the data that you might need for that route or to fulfill that request. So just to say, if you're talking about the home page, you, as a user, you go to the home page. Next.js before server components would say, okay, I need to give this person the home page. And the first step of that, before rendering the app, would be, okay, what data do I need for the home page? And maybe you'd call the CMS to get that data. And then from there, you would pass that CMS data to the React app, essentially. And now the React app has the data it needs to render on the server side before it goes as a fully baked page to the client. One of the issues with that is you have that that top level opportunity to load the data, but after that, you would be relying on like a client side fetch. So, just to give an example, if you figured out the content that you needed on the homepage from the CMS at that top in the route loader, that top level before the React app renders, then say you are starting to render the homepage and you realize, oh, this homepage has product tiles. They configured product tiles from the CMS. They want those to show in a grid. You obviously probably need some data from the commerce vendor in order to render those product tiles, but you kind of pass the point where you can load data on the server side. So you're left with some kind of what I'd call kind of hacky options to solve that problem. One of them would be just to load a shell of the product tiles and on the client side fetch the extra data you need from the commerce vendor. That does introduce that problem of you have to show some kind of loading spinner and wait for things to load in, which isn't the ideal user experience. And the other option would be in the route level loader, you'd have to look through all the content and figure out like what is all of the data I possibly will need to render this homepage. So essentially in the loader, you'd have to figure out which components are going to render and that will help you to figure out what data you need, which is obviously pretty clumsy because you have to know a lot about the UI on the back end to figure out like, oh, they're going to render a product tile. And so I need to go to the commerce vendor and fetch the commerce data. It introduces a lot of coupling potentially and a lot of complexity when you have to load that way. So
Coupling's bad.
yeah,
Right?
especially I think in Composable, the more complexity you have there, and add to that with Composable, you have multiple vendors happening. And you'd ideally like to be able to swap out vendors in the future if you needed to. And the reality is, if you have this kind of loading pattern, that can be extra difficult.
Do you find yourself like walking into potential traps when you're developing? Like were you walking into a tight coupling of of I guess what services? Like where it's like
I'll,
you could do it and it's like it might be easier, but it's going to end in tears. Do you face those type
I
of
mean,
things or might
that's software development pretty much. Like I can solve this problem for today. Like, if you're doing an implementation with say Commerce Tools and Amplience as your CMS, you
Mhm.
can pretty easily build a page and just assume a lot of stuff about Amplience and a lot of stuff about Commerce Tools. But you question the composability there because you've built this all very based around which vendors you have. So if you try to untangle that in the future and say, "Oh, we're going to switch to Contentful," it's not going to be much easier than just replatforming at that point,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it happen so many times and I man, I understand it. I understand why. You've got a deadline, you've got that's part of the reason that being somebody who's doing like an implementation of an existing system can be challenging is that this is not just to call this not best practice. Just it's like not a strong enough word. This is you're going to rue this day that you made this decision. But a lot of times you're just in a place where it's like, put it in the CSV, let's go. We're just going to have to update this in 5 different places and
For
just freeze
sure.
this because we have to be up. Uh, but
Yeah.
that's because of decisions that happened 6 months beforehand. And,
And
uh,
it's especially a problem with Composable because when you're on, a commerce platform, they kind of set things up for you in a way that's like you can kind of get away with a lot more. Like you can it's they've organized things in such a way that it'll be a little bit easier to untangle if you do make changes in the future.
mhm.
Whereas with Composable, you have a lot more rope to screw it up. And you can really get yourself into a world of hurt because you do have all this freedom and composability, which is great. But um, also, you know, can open some doors to some problems that maybe you didn't have with a platform approach.
You mentioned before routing layer. What is the routing layer?
Yeah, so I was referring to like the data loading pattern, which for a lot of these React meta frameworks that we were talking about, like Remix or Next.js, it's the patterns that they establish for how you can load your data on the server side before the React app renders. So for most of these, it's at the route level. So that's where the routing comes in, where it's like, okay, for Remix, I went to the PDP. Now I have a route level loader that I can use, which is on the server side. I know I'm on the PDP. Okay, what data do I need for my React app to render the PDP route? So that's kind of that's the data loading pattern. The problem with the route level loading pattern is more that you have to get everything there, and then once you start rendering actual components, it's since those need to be fully renderable in the browser, you can't have server side stuff inside of them. So once you've passed that server to client boundary, after you've loaded your route data, you can't load any more data from the server side before that would be delivered as a full web page. So that's kind of where the one of the weaknesses of that data loading pattern. We talked about some of the data loading pattern or problems with Next.js before server components,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the problems that this introduces, particularly for a composable storefront. But I don't think we got to how to server components and their role in kind of mitigating some of that. So server components are pretty new over the last couple of years, and they kind of allow you to compose components in a way where you can mix in, you can have stuff happening on the server effectively inside of your React app. So this for composable, I think the biggest benefit of this is it allows you to kind of build things in a more component based and modular way without having to um, deal with that complicated loading pattern where you have to figure out all of the data that you're going to need. And figuring out all that data you're going to need is especially problematic for a composable because you potentially have 3 or 4 vendors that you're talking to for one page. And so if you're having to load all of your data in that one spot, it's hard to do that in a simple way and to keep those vendors not super coupled to each other. So what server components would allow you to do is instead of having to load just in that one spot, you have more opportunities where, say the example that we've been talking about, where you have a page from the CMS where they're saying Amplience, where they're dropping components in, and they've added a couple of banners, and then they also add a grid with product tiles. So what server components would allow you to do is, as you're rendering that home page, you get to the point where you say, oh, I see that they want product tiles here, and they've configured, say, what SKUs they want in the CMS. The server component architecture would allow you to, at that point, then fetch the data from your commerce provider to, get whatever product data you need for that tile. So you kind of naturally have more of an opportunity to keep those things a little bit more decoupled. Whereas if you're loading it at the top level of every route, you really have to combine them, or figure out when there's commerce data inside of your content, which means your data loading is very tied to how the content is configured, which is obviously a challenge. I don't know.
Now, you mentioned before you've worked both in the monolith area, the monolith framework or architecture. You worked
Yeah.
in kind of more composable or headless, whatever you want to call it, architectures. But I was surprised we were talking earlier. You don't necessarily have all bad things to say about monolithic architectures. Could you talk about what it is you you I mean, we all have that sense of nostalgia for old systems that maybe did certain things a lot better. What were your thoughts on that?
Oh no, I mean, I think they for sure have their place. And what I was saying earlier, they do give you a good base and a good starting point where it's a lot more difficult to really botch things. They set up, an API essentially for how you deal with your commerce store. And sure, you can mess that up. But with the restrictions that they provide, they also kind of keep you in that box a little bit where you don't make really bad decisions, or they make the bad decisions a little bit harder to do, harder to make, I should say. Whereas with, Composable, you could probably find some reference store to start with, but the freedom that you get also opens these possibilities of uh, getting yourself into a mess. So that's definitely an issue in Composable. And then also, I think a lot of the React architecture has exposed some of these other problems that we were talking about with how you load your data. Whereas these monoliths were more server oriented, so you didn't have to worry so much about this server client boundary. It's like you can load data you want anywhere because the whole thing is rendered on the server, and so there's some good simplicity there, I think.
It's not very customizable, like you said. There are things that it prevents you, unless you make great and innovative effort. It prevents you from making certain mistakes. Although
Yeah.
I've known a few people. I might have been one of them myself that have gone to remarkable lengths to make a mistake in a monolithic architecture.
We all have for sure.
It's certainly it's one of those one of those balancing acts of constraint as opportunity, where you know if I can live with the constraints of this system, there's a trade-off there. I mean, it actually makes things more predictable, like you said, but you're also kind of in that little framework. And I wonder,
Hmm.
you know it's always it's hard to tell someone that they can't have the unicorn, though, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah. I mean, these platforms, they were built over a long period of time by people really experienced, and they know a lot about what problems there are with, an enterprise commerce store. So, and they've established kind of the general solutions to those in a straightforward way to customize. I think, we talked a little bit about some of the weaknesses of that. I mean, one of them is the you're constrained to the decisions of the monolith, for certain features and how they implemented those features. Just to take, for example, search. So if you're on Commerce Cloud, they have their search index, and it has its own capabilities that Salesforce has developed over a period of time, and those are great, but you are kind of constrained to how Salesforce has decided to do and manage search. Whereas with Composable, you have more freedom to say, okay, for my brand or my company, Algolia provides certain features that enable a new customer experience that I would do it either been really difficult to develop using the Salesforce search capabilities, or you'd have to, somehow extend it to not use them. And this selection of of different vendors for what they're good at is kind of what, to me, Composable is, one of the main benefits of Composable.
All right, Adam Klassen.
Covered it all. No.
Adam Klassen, technical architect at High Velocity. Thank you for your commerce chat today. And I appreciate you walking through Composable, your journey in development. And I hope to talk to you again soon. Okay. All
Yeah, thank you.
right.
Talk
Cheers.
to you later.
Thank you to Principal Technical Architect Adam Klassen for joining us this week. Join us for our next episode when we talk to the Principal UX Architect at Stone Rooster, Josh Jensen. Until then, I wish you an ice-cold emotional support seltzer in your fridge, genuine Vermont maple syrup on your pancakes, and high velocity.